We're going to talk for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we're going to leave plenty of time for Q&A to address some of these questions, and we're going to finish up by about 45 minutes after the hour, so everyone has a little bit of time to get coffee or some food before whatever their next thing is to do. So I'm Kevin Delaney. I'm the co-founder and editor of Reset Work. As some of you know, we have an email newsletter that is really focused obsessively on the changes to the workplace and actually making workplaces fairer and places where more people can thrive. We're about transforming the workplace. If you're not signed up for that, you can go to resetwork.co and you'll find amazing things like interviews with people like Tsedal, Neeley, who I'll introduce in a second, that we are covering every week. We're doing this event in partnership actually with a company called Nomadic, and they're a digital leadership academy, and they transform managers into leaders. They're pioneers of cohort-based learning, which is one of the most effective ways of training. And they are experts in teaching managers how to think about emerging disciplines, how to solve problems, how to lead. We're going to do a few more events like this. There's one next month, and we'll share that information with you all. And we're also pretty excited to announce that next month, we're going to release a program, an online training program with Nomadic called Working Hybrid. This is about best practices. It's a digital certificate program, and people can, it's a tool for managers actually to spend roughly 4 to 6 hours of their time to actually immerse themselves in the best practices around managing in a hybrid workplace. As people who attend to this, we'll share information with you about that as soon as it becomes available, and hope that you'd consider going deeper in this way. So today's discussion focused on most critical questions organizations are facing right now around the return to workplace. I see that there are a few in the chat, and we'll try and get to those. And as Lorna Hagen from Long Island, a good friend and former colleague of mine, mentioned, the focus I think that we are bringing to this is to make this a time of transformation and not just a time of transition. So I'm incredibly grateful for the two remarkable women who have joined us for this discussion today. I want to start by introducing Tsedal Neeley. She's a Harvard Business School professor who studies global virtual workforces and has been focused on this area for years. She has a book out that came out in March called Remote Work Revolution. It's a remarkable book, and it's remarkably relevant in surfacing a lot of the research that goes back decades to the best practices for organizations who are managing remote and hybrid configurations. So hello, Tsedal, and thank you so much for joining us.
I'm so delighted to be here today.
This is great. So, and I want to bring in Katie Burke. She's the Chief People Officer of HubSpot, which is a customer resource management company. That means they produce marketing, sales, and customer service software. Among her other accomplishments, Katie has an MBA from MIT. And HubSpot is particularly interesting to us because they've shifted to a hybrid work approach. They were remote-ish, as Katie has said, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But they're immersed in what this means for their organization. So hello, Katie.
So excited to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. Katie has written on, there's a Medium post in which she gets into HubSpot's approach that I recommend people take a look at, because it's really specific and constructive about how to approach this. So today, as you can see, we have an expert researcher in Tsedal in this area, and Katie Burke, who is a practitioner, operator, and the person to whom probably all of the complaints eventually wind up about how this is actually going. And so these two perspectives, I'm super excited to bring them together in this discussion. So I'm going to start with you. We'll talk a little bit, and then we'll start working through some of the questions that people have surfaced for us. So you've researched remote work for years, and the remote work revolution is built on that. What stands out for you from all of that in terms of what people should be thinking about, given the realities of this moment?
Great question. So for me, the idea that flexibility in our work arrangements can really work and people desire them. The discovery for many companies across multiple data sources, from Gartner Group to Harvard Business School Online, people are saying to the tune of 87 to 90% that they want to retain some form of flexibility into their work arrangements because they appreciate the autonomy, they appreciate the flexibility, they appreciate the reduction of commute hours throughout the week. They appreciate the ability to self-direct and contribute to their workplaces. But they also do want to see people every once in a while, but they want choice. And so the discovery for me is the exposure of virtuality and virtual work and the technological advancements that we've seen to enable that in the last 13 months has led us to leap forward into the future 10 to 15 years. And so my hope is that we can take advantage of what we've learned to construct truly flexible workplaces where everyone can thrive without any job insecurity.
And we've entered this phase of remote work just out of, very quickly, without a lot of preparation, out of necessity. But what you're saying, if I understand correctly, is that flexible hybrid work approaches that accommodate in-office and remote work actually can be better than the systems that we had before this crisis, because they allow workers to be more creative, productive, and ultimately have work fit in their lives in ways that work better for them. Is that a fair summary?
That is a fair summary. The big idea is that individuals have transformed in the last 13, 14 months, those of us who've had to work in this way. Organizations have also transformed. And so how is it that we can leverage the best parts of flexibility, whatever that means? There's no one size fits all, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But trusting people to be engaged, to be productive, without having to be in the office. I think that's the key point here.
Yeah. Katie, I want to pull you in. So HubSpot traditionally you've described it as a remote-ish model, about 10% of your staff working remote. As of January, you've officially shifted to a hybrid model for new employees. Can you explain the essential elements of how you're approaching that?
Absolutely. So echoing Tsedal's push, I don't think anyone misses the commute or long hours or people sneezing in the office. And so I think as we think about a return to work, I think we have an opportunity to imagine a different future. And so what we did at HubSpot was everyone has their own ideas about work, and they're usually based on their own personal experiences. And so we wanted to drop that. So all last summer, what we did was we brought in panels. We brought in panels of soon-to-be college graduates to hear what they thought about and what they wanted on flexibility. We talked to some senior experience candidates. We talked to experts in compensation and benefits. We talked to DEI experts, and we basically agreed we were going to check our own assumptions about work at the door and imagine what the future could look like as we compete for talent. And I think most companies need to be willing to reimagine the way things were in a post-COVID world. And I think the opportunity to compete for talent, everyone talks about the war for talent, but when it actually comes back to getting back to work, we want to infuse a ton of friction in the process. So I laugh every morning this week. I've cracked up laughing because people say, well, hybrid work is hard. It absolutely is hard. I don't think, Tsedal's book is a great example of, she talks about the challenges of remote work and how you might have to adapt if you're an agile team. I acknowledge all of those challenges, and yet I still think that is a whole lot easier than having a leaky bucket of talent in your organization. And so I am up for the challenge. I am really railing against all these people adding a bunch of friction in the process. I think the 70% of people who don't have communications from their team on what to expect are going to get pretty frustrated really fast. And so I think we have a huge opportunity, and I'm excited to have a bunch of people thinking about this on the call today.
That's great. Yeah, and we're starting to see this wave of sort of pushback on hybrid, basically people saying it's hard. There's a Boston Globe op-ed that was much discussed a week or two ago, which sort of put some, in my view, straw man arguments against it, and basically said it's hard and everything is hard, basically. So
the two things in headlines this week were hybrid is hard and WeWork CEO said the most engaged people are in the office. It's like, weird. He doesn't have a vested interest in this at all, does he? Like those two headlines, I'm like, come on, we got to ask deeper questions, which is why I'm so excited.
Which is why we're here. I want to start going through some of the questions, some of the essential questions people have. And, one of them is just a really basic one. What is the best way to configure a hybrid approach? And maybe we start with Katie, and you can talk like pretty specifically about how many days in the office, how do you take employees on this journey with you? I would mention that, Nick Bloom at Stanford has been talking to us and just put out a piece in HR about how employees shouldn't be allowed to choose the days in which they work in the office. So that's among the questions I think people are grappling with. So maybe Katie, you can start and say like specifically what options are you giving to employees? And then Tsedal, I'd love for you with what you're seeing across organizations and best practices.
So I have a slightly different perspective from Nick on this, which is I think Tsedal used a term that is really meaningful here, which is trust. I think what we kind of have an opportunity to do is redefine how we trust our employees and how we build a workplace based on trust. Well, you can only trust people if you agree to give them some autonomy. So what I'm seeing from a lot of companies is saying, you don't get to pick the day. You can pick the day, but it can't be Mondays or Fridays. You don't pick the day, but only if it's a lunar new year, a leap year, you name it. And I think this comes back to when you're faced with fundamental business challenges, there's a natural inclination to infuse friction when things are hard. And I think instead, what we're trying to do is infuse trust, empathy, and acknowledgement of the hard problem. So said differently, at HubSpot, to answer your question, we're not picking days. If you pick flex, you pick the number of days you come in or don't come in. We're actually not going to track it, and we kind of don't care. What we do want to do is trust managers and teams to build norms that work for them. And so I do think we'll have leaders who say, just a heads up, I'm going to be in the office on Wednesdays. If you want in-person time with me, that's the best time to book it. But I think this notion that we have to dictate when people have to be there and pick days is honestly reverting us back to the old ways of thinking and limiting what's possible as we kind of re-engage in the hybrid model. Now, I think the reason that the Globe op-ed was so successful is there's a lot of trepidation. A lot of people are nervous. And we talked before the call started about frontline managers and what we're expecting them to do. I acknowledge all the hard things we're going to have to do to get there. And I still think it's worth it because I think for far too long, your geographic opportunities have been predicated on your zip code. So something like 90% of the jobs created in tech 5 years ago were in 5 zip codes, Boston being one of them, all jokes aside about where we're located. Yeah. And I just think if we're going to imagine a more inclusive, diverse workforce, we have to be willing to challenge where people work. And if you make people come in on Wednesdays, turn out they still have to live within an hour, hour and a half, 2 hour radius of where you're working. So we're not really expanding opportunity. And so I would encourage people really thinking about infusing friction in to think about a less frictionless model that still acknowledges how hard hybrid is going to be to make work.
That's great. Tsedal, do you want to jump in?
I couldn't agree more with Katie. I think she has it spot on. I first started to work with and advise companies with the future of work March 2020. So almost right after the pandemic, this was the vaccine maker. And I've been working with several companies since then. And I'll tell you this, the idea that we can be very prescriptive on how the work arrangements are conducted are not going to work in the long term. And why is that? Because the reason people are so engaged and productive and have satisfaction in this kind of virtual environment is the autonomy piece and choice. There will be times where you have to overlap with your managers, and people understand that. But to say that you have to be in on these, I think is in a way antithesis to this new approach. And I'll tell you this too, as I look at and talk to people who are part of the digital revolution, here I'm talking about data and technology, which I truly believe is now right around the corner because we've advanced so much. Many companies are kind of pushing their digital transformation reimagine agenda. And the reason I bring this up is that we're worrying about how to collaborate with Sal and Sally. We need to prepare workforces where we're going to be collaborating with AI bot. And so we need to be forward thinking in how we reconceptualize what work means, injecting flexibility, injecting technology, and many have been experimenting with this. My worst fear is that we not only, by the way, I have a lot of respect for Nicholas Bloom. He's a Stanford economist. He's done a study with Citric, China-based agency, and they discovered how well virtuality works. I mean, their productivity has gone up, but I actually don't think he has enough insights into what we've been seeing. Hybrid work is not new. It's not new. Many have been using the hybrid format for a long time. It just means that you have a distributed workforce and you need to lead people who are not all co-located. That's what this means. Of course, it's harder, but it's also a way to the future. If you get this right, you're going to get the next wave right.
That's a really good point. And one of the cool things about your book is that you talk about how actually tech companies have since the 1990s been engaging in hybrid and remote setups of one sort or other. And there is a sort of corpus of work there. The argument for requiring people to come on specific days gets at, I think, one of the concerns that's broader about hybrid work arrangements, which are the biases of managers around proximity. So the idea is if you don't happen to come in on Wednesday when your manager is in the office, there's something in our human biases that's sort of hardwired into us that if we don't actually see you, or if I see Sally, who's in the office with me every Wednesday, and Sal is not, my perception might be that Sally's a better worker, even if that's not true. How do you address that?
So I'd love to hear what Katie has to say about this, but this is what I truly believe from the many anecdotal experiences that I've had over the last 13 or more months. It's that people have more empathy today for what it's like to collaborate with others who are not in the same room with them than ever before, than ever in my entire career. So the paranoia around I can't see Sally, is Sally working, is debunked. Sally has proven all of this in the last 13, 14 months. So I think that from leaders' standpoint, their arguments around having to see people in order to see their productivity and engagement is debunked. But Sally and others will experience FOMO, fear of missing out.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure we explicitly ensure that that's not going to happen through these launches and relaunches that I talk about. But I'd love to hear Katie's point on this. How have you dealt with this?
I think it's a really important point, and I do think it's important to call out that proximity bias is a real thing that we know, to your point, Kevin, humans care about. I think one thing I've been pushing people on is during the pandemic, we've lost over 2 million women, in particular Black and Latinx women, from the workforce. And so we talk about that as a separate problem. Then we come back to welcoming people back. We're like, yeah, but you got to be here Wednesdays. And oh, by the way, you got to be here at these specific times, which are not convenient for childcare and for other caretaking roles. And so one thing I would encourage, like for everything with hybrid work, there are certainly problem statements. But I would argue with the labor employment rate for women at the rate it is right now, it's the lowest it's been in decades, that we have to reimagine a different future. And so when I think about FaceTime in the office or requiring people to be there on Wednesdays, I think about the fact that we need to replace the social capital or the interpersonal connectedness and trust that comes with those interactions with something else. And so to me, that looks like better training for managers to engage on things outside of work. So Tsedal and I can connect around a shared interest, or we can have a conversation where I understand a little bit more about what drives her. We do need to make sure that those opportunities happen, but I think we need to resist the temptation or the assumption that that has to be in person for that connection to transpire. Otherwise, you're not really building a hybrid or remote friendly workforce, because someone still has to be adjacent. And I love the comment Megan made in the chat, which is it's not just women, it's also people with disabilities. For
Exactly.
so many people, abilities and accessibilities has been a barrier for them entering the workforce. In the last year, we've seen infinite possibilities created by hiring people in rural areas who are caretakers or caregivers or who have abilities and accessibilities challenges. And now all of a sudden we're like, but they got to be here Wednesdays at 10. And I just think it's a failure of imagination. So I acknowledge and agree that managers need a toolkit for engaging with people and getting to know them on a personal level and developing social capital. I just don't think you need to be in the office to do that.
I want to touch on talent and kind of recruiting and retention, which I think is one of the big concerns that a lot of people have. But before I do, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we essentially have these two crises. We have this crisis around the or crisis or opportunity around the transformation of work that the pandemic has created. We also have a crisis around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the two of them actually, I think, intersect or potentially intersect in organizations that that embrace that, and potentially in organizations that ignore it as well. They collide, and so I'm interested in whether how you're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion in the context of return to workplace and hybrid approaches. Katie, do you want to start, and then Tsedal?
Yeah, I think it's so important that we talk about it. And I think so at HubSpot, a higher percentage of our remote population are BIPOC individuals. And so I think we have to really get intentional about the fact, I don't think that's an accident, by the way. I think one thing we're hearing from many BIPOC individuals in the US is once you realize you can live in a city that is closer to home, where, housing is more affordable, or where you can be closer to loved ones, then a whole talent opportunity represents itself to companies like ours. But also we have an obligation then to say, okay, you trusted us with your work experience. Now we need to make you proud you made that decision by offering you great career growth opportunities. So I'll tell you a few things that we've been thinking about. One is not limiting manager, director, VP roles that can be remote. So one of the things you have to do is make sure you cannot just hire people remotely, but also grow them remotely. The second thing we're doing is focus groups specific to our BIPOC employees to go, okay, help us understand. So for example, what does code switching look like in a remote environment? Let's not say it doesn't exist. Let's say it's different and acknowledge what that looks like. And let's train managers to talk through and think through that on that side of things. And so I think DEI needs to be an important part of this conversation. But I also think it's important to note that we are hearing not just from women, but also from BIPOC leaders around the world that they want career growth opportunities with companies that care about this stuff. And so what we're trying to do is make our diversity initiative and our hybrid initiative hand in hand as part of a broader talent strategy. And I think talking about them as one versus talking about them as discrete projects.
Great. Tsedal?
Listen, Steve Kruskos, who's the Ernst & Young global managing partner in charge of EY services and business functions, says that the next couple of years will bring to sharp relief the war for talent in ways that we've never seen in our lifetime. This is what he believes based on their observations at Ernst & Young, and I believe it as well. And so how does the work models that we think about also connect with diversity and inclusion is that the pipeline problem that people perceive to be real can be overcome by adding new pipes and enhancing our regional and geographical talent pool searches without having people move in various cities. They can stay in their communities, they can stay close to family, but yet can still work for us effectively. That's one of the ways in which we can increase our diversity. The other thing is many Black employees have reported, this is based on a Slack survey, that microaggressions or the daily experiences, the small cuts that they used to experience have suddenly vanished. Being confused for someone else who looks like them, things like that, going away has made the work experience much more pleasant. So can we lean into this by ensuring that there is, in fact, a way to create experiences? And these are just two examples that I'm giving here, but I think this could be true for women as well. The number of women who have left the workforce is alarming, as Katie mentioned, alarming. And if we embraced flex time and giving people the ability to segment their day in a way that works for them, we could retain people. And smart companies that I've encountered are doing things like childcare, virtual activities between the hours of 3 to 5 p.m. in order to give families relief. So we need to think about the whole person as best as possible and find ways to make work work.
And the data, as you mentioned on your 2 points, are incredibly striking. So if you look at the fastest job growth areas in the U.S. over the last decade or so, most of them are in areas without historically Black populations, basically. And so there's been actually geographic segregation that actually of opportunity that remote work could potentially address. And then there's the Slack Future Forum data you mentioned, Tsedal, where it's incredibly striking. Something like 5% of Black women want to return to the workplace. And their analysis is that, which is much lower than other groups, and that there is the microaggressions and the code switching that you mentioned that is less onerous in a remote setting. We're going to turn it over to questions in just a minute. I have a lot of more questions for you, but one of them is, there are these data about how surveys that show that some number of Americans, and I've seen numbers ranging from 8% to over 40% of American workers are interested in switching jobs. Once things stabilize, they've had a pretty miserable past year, and they're ready to change employers and look elsewhere. This happens in a market where demand for labor in certain parts of the knowledge economy is particularly intense as the economy picks up again. So what is I guess both of you, maybe if you can quickly summarize like how organizations should be thinking about this retention and recruiting pretty intense challenge that is upon a lot of us right now.
I think I'll start, and then I'm super excited to hear Tsedal's answer. I think on that front, you're exactly right. I think we're going to see a ton of movement. And I think it comes down to something Tsedal said earlier, which is, what are you doing for me as a human being? So I think it's not just flexibility and where I'm going to work. It's also, as a caregiver, what are you providing in terms of how you support parents and how you support kids and families? What are you doing on mental health? That's a huge question that we're getting from a lot more folks. How do you think about long-term compensation? What do you do when things get hard? Can you give me an example of someone who's grown and gotten promoted remotely? And so I think how we treat people as humans is often getting overlooked. And so I think in the competition for talent, people tend to over-index on things that are easy to measure or look at. So for example, attrition rates, compensation, demand, that sort of thing. And I think they're missing the opportunity to go a level deeper, which is people, after reflecting for a year on what they want in life and work, want to spend less time doing things they don't care about and don't want to do, and more time doing things they actually care about. And as a result, that means a greater focus on them as a human and how you support their growth as a human being. And I think that's where we're indexing to hopefully win the war on talent at HubSpot.
One of the things that we've learned is that during the last 13, 14 months, and especially with the explosion of online learning opportunities, many people have done their own upskilling. And in a recent survey, 40% of the people who were surveyed in this particular study said that I've spent the last year learning and growing, and I'm going to look for opportunities, whether it's in my company or elsewhere, to be able to use these skills. So we probably need to spend time understanding people's career interests and see if we can fulfill them within our own organizations. That's one. You can't take this for granted. The second thing is questions around purpose. We've never seen much more purpose-driven era. I'm talking about the Harvard Business School. People want to do things that's purposeful. And I think this is part of the fallout of the global pandemic that we're in. You know, we sometimes forget, it's like we're in the middle of a global pandemic, crises. Many months ago, San Francisco was orange. Y'all remember that?
Yeah.
Wasn't that the scariest thing?
Yeah.
But people are saying, I need more purpose in my work and what we do. So companies have to ensure that they're articulating the purpose that people can feel connected to as well, among other things. And then finally, if we don't take advantage of this remote, hybrid, flex time, flex work that people are longing for, they'll go to the next company who will offer it to them.
Yeah.
They're saying that. This is not me predicting, projecting. These are data-driven comments. If you can't give me what I want, I'm going to look for it elsewhere.
And on purpose, it seems to me what I've read in terms of the research is that for leaders, managers, a lot of it feels like over communication, but you can never actually communicate too often about the purpose of an organization, particularly in this time. I want to go to questions from some of our people who are nice people who have taken some time out of their day to join us here. There are a few questions. There's one from Maureen White and one from Dagnall Folger, and they center around the identifying that there are two dimensions that we're talking about here. First is the location. So there's remote work and hybrid work, which is a combination of remote and in-person. But then there's the flex time. And so Maureen's question is, does hybrid mean the end of the 40-hour 9-to-5 work week? And then Dagnall's question is, it's about the complexity of actually managers navigating both time flexibility and location flexibility. If it's too large a lift for managers, do we risk this time sliding back to simply transition and not transformation? So maybe you could talk about that.
So I don't know if you're looking at me, but
Go ahead.
So hybrid does not mean the 40-hour week goes away. Flexible work models means that, which is an opportunity for companies to explore what that can look like for them. For example, I'm making this up. Can we work from Monday through Thursday and do all that we need to do, and Friday to the next Monday we don't work? So it's really about exploring various work models that can potentially advance our work. Now, we need to be very thoughtful about our ecosystem, our clients, our partners when we think about flexible schedules. It's not that we're suddenly going to be moving out the mainstream. It's how can we do the segmentation based on tasks and functions, etc. But the second question is, was this going to be too tough for managers? The answer to that is, it's going to be tough for managers who seek to control rather than let go and trust. If you're trying to control, say, okay, who's working what, where, when, how, you're not going to be able to survive this. But if you say, you work and we'll continue to communicate, hybrid does not mean we're going to stop talking to each other. We are currently on a live synchronous communication tool, all of us here together. So we're talking, but hybrid just means that we can be in various locations. By the way, the people who are more satisfied from a job satisfaction standpoint than remote workers are those who can work from anywhere. I can sit at a cafe and still work, that kind of a thing, or Hawaii, whatever, you know.
I want to come back to you in a minute just quickly about trust, because one of the things that you cover in your book is the research on how you actually establish trust, which is the point you're making, a really important point here. But Katie, I want to come to you first just to address this question of the flex time. Is the 9-to-5, 5-day-a-week work week dead, and is it too complicated for managers to take both the dimensions of time and location?
So on the 40-hour work week, I would say it was kind of dead before the pandemic. So the example that I often use is, even though our co-founder, Dharmesh, and I used to come into the office often, he's a night owl, I'm an early bird. We always overlap for only a certain number of hours a day. So people can blame that on the pandemic or on our hybrid workforce. The truth is, we were always kind of ships passing the night and would always have to correspond about when we were going to be a place. Sure, we could create a rule that says Katie and Dharmesh need to be in the office from 10 to 2, or we could interact as humans and share little details like Tsedal suggests in her book that say, like, here's how I like to work, here are my boundaries, here's what works for me, here's when I'm most productive. To me, I'd rather work with people who are open to that conversation than feel like I'm there for no reason just to show FaceTime. With regard to time zones, the conversation that we've had, I'll use our recruiting team as an example. We have managers all over the world on this side of things. They have identified essentially an hour and a half time window for any team meetings, and that's when they hold any of their cross team meetings. So they hold time on the calendar regularly to make sure that they're collaborating on that stuff. I like that model way better. It gives the teams autonomy and trust. It infuses it with empathy, and it doesn't mean that everyone at all hours is working late into the evenings. It also takes the burden off teams in areas like JPAC from always staying up or always getting up early by holding that time on a calendar. Now, we do have a few roles at HubSpot that are customer facing where we do have times when our customers expect people to be available. So for customer support, for example, we say you're working the 10 to 6 shift, and that's what you're signing up for. I'm a big believer that clarity is kindness, but what I'm pushing people on is to say that is for a real job with real shifts that requires things for our obligation to our customers. If you just prefer people to be there because it's your preference, that is control over empathy, and that is not trusting people do what we want them to do. And so I'm all about being explicit. If you have to be somewhere for a job, I saw some people note facilities folks. I have front desk team members on my team that I'm so proud to employ. We say you get to greet people when they come into the door at HubSpot. That is an opportunity and a gift. And for people who love being in the office, that's awesome. But let's be really clear about when people have to be there for their job function and when a manager just wants them there for control. Those are two very different and important distinctions to draw.
That's great. And you anticipated one of the questions from Lord Tsedal about time zones. So let's come back on trust. Can you just give us a few kind of bullet points about how we should be thinking about it? Because it's really foundational for this world that a lot of people are entering.
Absolutely. May I also just say that for essential on-site people that Katie mentioned, we need to find ways to reward those people, give them 5-10 days out of the year to say, go remote learn. These are days for you, so that they don't feel like it's a privilege and luxury that they cannot have. So rewarding them in some ways through time has been very effective. I just want to mention that because that's another inclusion point when it comes to this new world that we're talking about. As far as trust goes, trust is one of the two most studied, researched, practiced area in remote virtual hybrid environments. Because the reason is if we're not together, our sense of confidence in others erode. So when it comes to trust, I often talk about the trusting curve and that there are two types of trust. One is called cognitive swift trust. And all you need to know to confer that is whether someone is reliable. That's very knowable, and whether someone has the qualifications or the competence to do the work. So if you recognize that those things are present, you confer trust, you give trust. It's incomplete information, but it's very effective for remote environments. The second one is called emotional trust. Longer to get there. And this is grounded in the belief that we care about you, that your concern is important to us, your interests are important to us. And as collaborators, and especially as managers, we have to have emotional trust. And how do you build that virtually? Self-disclosure and empathy. Self-disclosure, sharing of yourself, mature self-disclosure. You know, you don't want to tell people about your anger management classes. That kind of makes people uncomfortable. And the second part is not only possessing empathy, people talk about empathy all the time, but you want to reflect that empathy through your actions and deeds. And that promotes emotional trust. You need both. You can operate with the Swift cognitive very well.
And one thing that I've read about the research supporting is the idea that one-on-one connections within teams are actually pretty effective at establishing team trust. So you may be awkward to have 20 people on a Zoom call, and you're, as the manager, you're mandating them to have fun and everyone go find a cocktail. But if you can actually team up people and guide them in a structured way to get to know each other, that is a one-on-one is a foundation as opposed to biting off the whole group. So We have time maybe for one more question. And I think, one of the ones that gets at what we're talking about, and I think one of the important issues around mental health and actually creating work-life balance, one of the challenges for individuals, so we talked about the challenges for managers, for individuals is in a flex hybrid arrangement is actually separating their work and their life. And how do you, and particularly given the issues around burnout and stress and mental health, how do you ensure people's mental health in environments that are less sort of rigidly defined? And maybe Tsedal, do you want to jump in?
To ensure that we have strong employment assistance programs. I mean, you don't want individual managers to get into an area zone that they're not qualified to do, but you need managers to pay attention to what's going on, to even ask, how are you? How can we support you? And then do the referrals, which is what we're seeing. And in many organizations, adding a well-being person, a chief well-being officer, depending on the size of the organization, to make sure that there's not only promotion at the individual or team level, but at the organization level, a lot of programs, activities, access to different things. At HBS, through the pandemic, there were exercise classes and other things that were being promoted to make sure that people are doing self-care and that the institution cares about that and tries to facilitate the connections and the opportunities.
So I think we just about hit time. Katie, do you have a quick thought on that as we wrap up?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would say is just that leaders need to walk the walk and normalize talking about mental health and practicing it themselves. So one of our best Zoom calls during the pandemic had one of our executives who's also a parent talking about just the sheer complete burnout and overwhelm they felt. And I think just normalizing the fact that it's not just something you're asking your employees to do, but you all are prioritizing makes a big difference. The other thing is we've done no internal meeting Friday, and then we're doing a whole company week shutdown in July to help normalize the fact that people need a little bit of a break from Zoom.
That's great. So I love this. This is great. We all spend our days surfing around the internet looking for answers to the questions that are troubling us about what this new world of work is. And in these 45 minutes, you both have brought incredible insights and specific guidance, I think, for people on these questions. So in this moment of uncertainty and anxiety, I think this is an incredible service that you both are doing by talking to people about your own experiences and your own research. So we thank you very much, Tsedal. Thank you, Katie, Burke, and Tsedal is from HBS. She has this book that's a great book. Both Katie and I have read it, Remote Work Revolution. And Katie is the Chief People Officer of HubSpot. I'm Kevin Delaney from Reset Work. And as we said, we'll be doing more of these. We'll have an event in the next month, in the middle of June, where we're going to dig into some of these topics again. And we're hard at work pulling together a manager training program with our partners at Nomadic to help people navigate hybrid work and actually translate some of these research best practices into concretely what a manager needs to do to succeed and actually have their team succeed. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day and good luck as you all navigate these things.
Bye,
Thanks, Reset, for a great conversation. Bye, Tsedal.
Bye.
Bye.